A cold wind howled through the narrow streets of Maplewood, a quiet town nestled somewhere in rural Vermont. It was late afternoon, the kind of winter day where the sun gave up early and the shadows stretched long across the snow-covered pavement. Inside St. Joseph's Medical Center, patients filled every available seat in the waiting area. Some wore masks, some held onto the arms of loved ones, but most sat in silence, waiting for their names to be called one by one, like a slow, invisible clock ticking toward uncertain outcomes. Near the entrance, where the revolving door let in icy gusts every few minutes, a figure slowly emerged from the biting wind. Her coat was threadbare, a patchwork of age and wear. Her hands, blue-veined and bony, clutched a wooden cane that had seen better decades. Her hair, silver and tangled, peeked from under a woolen cap that drooped low over her brow. Her name was Margaret White. She was 81, and today she had walked 5 miles in the snow to get here. Her breath came in short, visible puffs. Each step was a battle against a cold, the pain in her chest, and the years that clung heavily to her bones. As she entered the lobby, her clouded eyes scanned the reception desk. She waited for a break in the line, then shuffled forward. "Excuse me, dear," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I was hoping I could see a doctor today." The young nurse behind the desk, blonde, efficient, clearly overworked, looked up without warmth. "Do you have an appointment, ma'am?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "No, I don't. I was hoping you could. Do you have insurance?" Again, Margaret hesitated, then offered the truth with the kind of quiet dignity that often goes unrecognized in the modern world. "No, I don't. I don't have insurance, or much money either. But I've been having some pain." And the nurse exhaled sharply, already turning her eyes back to the monitor. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is a private hospital. We can't admit walk-ins without insurance or payment. You'll have to try the county clinic down in Bellevue." Margaret's hands trembled slightly on the cane. She tried to nod, to thank the woman, and back away gracefully. But the blow of rejection was sharp. Her legs, already weak from the cold, and the long walk, gave way beneath her. There was a faint gasp in the room as Margaret collapsed to the floor with a soft thud. A few people turned their heads, but none moved. The nurse stood frozen behind the counter. Somewhere, a child began to cry. Margaret lay there, her body curled like a question mark on the cold tile. She blinked slowly, trying to catch her breath, but her breaths came ragged, her chest rising and falling like a sail in a dying wind. No one moved, and then a voice, firm, commanding, cutting through the silence. Like a scalpel. "What on earth is going on here?" Heads turned. From down the hallway, a man in a white coat strode forward with urgency. His name was Dr. David Miller, director of St. Joseph's. At 60, his face was lined with experience, his presence both respected and feared in the hospital's halls. He approached, looking from the nurse to the frail woman on the ground. The nurse straightened. "Dr. Miller, sir, she doesn't have insurance. She refused to leave when I told her," but her voice faltered as Dr. Miller stepped past her, his eyes now locked on Margaret. And then he stopped. He went still, as if something deep in his bones recognized what his eyes were still trying to understand. His voice broke the moment. "Margaret." She stirred slightly at the sound of her name. Her eyes, dull with fatigue, tried to focus. Dr. Miller dropped to his knees. The room froze. The director of St. Joseph's, the man who had performed complex surgeries, who managed millions in grants and equipment, who ran this hospital with the precision of a general, was now kneeling on the floor, in front of an old woman. No one had bothered to help. He reached for her trembling hand. "Margaret, it's me, David. David Miller." There was a pause. The kind of pause that only happens when the soul recognizes something the mind cannot explain. And then, a single tear ran down Margaret's cheek. Her lips parted. "David." The silence in the room grew heavier than the snow falling outside. A few patients covered their mouths. The nurse behind the desk looked down in shame. David tightened his grip on her hand. "It's me. I'm here now. I won't let you go again." Outside, the wind pressed against the glass, as if trying to witness what was happening inside. But it wasn't just a moment of reunion. Something larger had just begun. A reckoning. Our remembrance. A promise rising from the frozen ground. And in that instant, Margaret closed her eyes, not from pain or weakness, but from peace. But peace would have to wait. The monitor on the wall flickered. A call went out for a stretcher. Nurses came running, not because a protocol demanded it, but because something in the air had shifted. Something that could not be undone. Margaret's story had only just returned to life, and David's was just beginning. Time seemed to pause. For a fleeting moment. The entire lobby of St. Joseph's stood frozen, not in confusion, but in disbelief. The director of the hospital, Dr. David Miller, was kneeling in the middle of the tiled floor, his hand gently cradling that of the old woman, who only moments earlier had been dismissed as a nobody. The same man who had once lectured rooms full of medical students about protocols, policies, and best practices, was now choking back tears in the shadow of a woman who looked like she didn't belong in that pristine facility at all. "David," she whispered again, her voice as frail as paper. Her hand quivered slightly in his, and her eyes searched his face slowly, carefully, as though trying to peel back the layers of time. It had been decades, but the soul never forgets the hands that once held it together. "Yes," David said, his voice breaking. "It's me. I'm here." A nurse standing nearby awkwardly bent down, finally sensing the gravity of the moment. Should we call? She STAMMERED. David didn't look up. He was brushing Margaret's forehead with a gentleness that stunned everyone around him. "Get a gurney. Page the emergency team. Now." The staff scattered like startled birds. Doctors, nurses, even the janitor nearby, each of them now, wide-eyed and alert. But their urgency wasn't born from duty. It came from shame and awe, because it was suddenly obvious that this woman, this elderly, shivering, castaway soul, was someone far more important than they had ever imagined. David stayed by her side as the paramedics arrived, lifting her carefully onto a stretcher. He never let go of her hand. When the wheeled bed turned toward the hallway, he walked beside it, his grip steady, his pace in sync with the heart monitor's fragile beeping. "Don't worry," he whispered to her as they entered the emergency unit. "You're not alone this time." And for a brief second, Margaret closed her eyes, not from fear, but from the strange comfort of being remembered. Inside the ER, the lights were bright and clinical. The air smelled of antiseptic and urgency. Nurses snapped into motion. Blood pressure was checked. Monitors were attached. An oxygen mask was gently placed over her mouth. But amidst the chaos, David remained anchored. He pulled a stool beside the bed, leaned in close, and whispered words only Margaret could hear. Outside, the hallway buzzed with quiet speculation. Word had already begun to ripple. "Did you see that?" The director kneeling. No one could remember the last time they'd seen David Miller show anything other than confidence. He was known for being stern, brilliant, untouchable. But now, he looked like a boy lost in time, clutching at the edges of something he had once let go. As Margaret drifted into semi-consciousness, David's memories began to stir. They came like flickering film reels, dusty but vivid. A small house on the edge of a forgotten town. A warm bowl of soup. The smell of old books and linoleum floors. But above all, a woman's voice, gentle, hoarse from age, but always humming some old hymn as she stirred the pot or mended his worn-out clothes. And then there was the flood. The cold, relentless current dragging his 8-year-old body down. The terror of breathlessness. The desperate grip of tiny hands clinging to nothing. And suddenly, strong arms around him. Pulling, holding, saving. That was her. Margaret back then. Everyone called her Miss Maggie. A widow with no children of her own, living in a weather-worn trailer surrounded by rust and wildflowers. But she had taken him in, cleaned him up, gave him soup and a pillow and, perhaps for the first time, a reason to feel safe. He had been a foster kid, with nowhere to go, and she had given him home. The years blurred after that. He was taken to the city by a charity group, given a chance to go to school, to escape the cycle of poverty. She had insisted. "Go, David. Don't look back. Just promise me. You'll become someone kind." He had promised, and he had left, and then he had forgotten. Until today. The machines in the ER hummed softly. The beeping was steady, but faint. Margaret was stable, for now. David placed her hand gently on the blanket and stood up. He turned toward the window and let the years catch up to him. What had he become? He had the power to save lives. He had the respect of a city, the comfort of wealth, the admiration of peers. But somewhere in all the accomplishments, he had let a part of his soul grow quiet. And now, here it was, returning not with a celebration, but with a broken woman on a hospital bed. Outside, the snow had started falling again, soft, like forgiveness. David stepped out of the room. The nurses looked at him differently now. Not with reverence, but with understanding. Something had shifted. Not just in him but in this place. And that shift was only beginning. Because, what David didn't yet know, was that Margaret had a story of her own. One he had never heard. One that would shake everything he believed about the past, and one that would soon lead him into the deepest chapter of his life. The search for a truth buried by time, and a promise long overdue. The hospital lights faded in David's mind as the hum of machines gave way to another sound entirely, the distant roar of rushing water. Not in the sterile hallways of St. Joseph's, but somewhere else. Somewhere older. Somewhere buried under years of ambition and silence. His memory took him back to a different winter. It was February 1972. A time when he was just 8 years old. A boy with hollow eyes, and a coat 2 sizes too big. Wandering the back roads of rural Vermont with no name anyone cared to remember. He had no mother, no father, just a string of homes that called themselves temporary. And a hunger that never truly went away. That year, the rivers overflowed. Weeks of snow had melted under a freak rainstorm, and the ice-swollen branches of the White River snapped, like twigs, as water surged through the valley. Sirens screamed in the distance. Radios buzzed with warnings. But no one had warned him. David had been crossing a footbridge, near a forgotten junkyard, when the wood gave out beneath his feet. One moment he was walking, and the next he was tumbling. Cold, chaos, darkness. The river took him like it had been waiting. He didn't know how long he'd been under, long enough to feel the cold crawl into his bones. Long enough for his tiny hands to lose grip of the fallen log he'd tried to hold. The world spun. The sky disappeared. And in that moment, when the water had nearly claimed him, he saw her. A shape in the current. Arms. A shout. Then warmth. He gasped, coughing water as a woman pulled him up by the collar of his soaked flannel shirt. She was shouting over the storm, her boots sinking into the river mud as she dragged him to the bank. Her face was red with effort, her hands trembling, her breathing ragged. "Hold on, sweetheart," she rasped. "Just hold on." They collapsed together near the roots of an old maple tree, both shaking, both soaked. And there, in the middle of a flood-torn world, Margaret White cradled a boy who had no one, no name worth calling, no future worth mentioning. Remembered her smelled wood smoke and lavender. He remembered the way she looked at him, not with pity, not with judgment, but with recognition, as if she had once been lost too. She took him in that night. Her home was a rusted trailer on the edge of town, surrounded by broken fences and sagging porch steps. There was no heat except the wood stove, no food except what she stretched into soup, and no bed except the one she gave up so he could sleep. But it was the warmest place he had ever known. She called him David, not because it was his name, but because she said he looked like a David she once knew, a boy who never came home from war. She told stories as she patched the holes in his jeans and boiled potatoes until the skin peeled off like paper. And every night, she would sit at the edge of the mattress, her hands folded in prayer, whispering words he didn't understand. But he felt them. He felt seen. For the first time in his life, he felt like he mattered. "I don't have much," she once said, handing him a chipped mug of tea. "But if you've got a roof, and someone who cares if you make it to morning, then you've got enough to try again." They lived like that for 3 winters. In the summers, she taught him how to plant beans. In the fall, how to patch up the roof with old tires. He went to school some days, stayed home others. But he was never hungry again. Never cold. Never invisible, until the day the van came. It was from a city charity, run by clean-shaven men, in pressed coats and neat clipboards. They were looking for children without family, without homes. And Margaret knew what they were offering. A chance. She packed his bag quietly. A jacket, his school notebook, a photo of them, drawn in crayon, taped to the inside cover. He didn't understand why she was crying, until the door closed behind him. "You have to go," she whispered, kneeling to his eye level. "You have to become someone better than this place. But promise me something, David." He nodded, tears already pooling. "Promise me, you'll grow up kind. Don't forget what it feels like to be small, to be scared, to be alone. And if you ever find someone like that, don't walk past them," he promised. And then he left. The charity took him to Burlington, where he was placed in a foster home. Later adopted. He was smart, and quiet, and determined. He climbed through schools, became somewhat respectable. His past was never discussed. It was sealed like an old wound. He stopped writing letters after the first year. The postcards never came back. He assumed she had moved on, or passed away. But the truth was worse. He had forgotten her. Until now. Back in the hospital room, David stared down at Margaret's frail body. Her fingers were curled under the blanket, her cheeks hollow, her breath shallow. But she was still. They're still breathing, still waiting. I'm so sorry, he whispered, voice cracking. I should have come sooner. Her eyes fluttered open, faint but aware. You're here now, she said, and nothing else. And just like that, it was enough. But as David sat by her bedside, holding the hand that once pulled him from a flood, he didn't know that another storm was coming. One far older, one far more painful, one that would shake the foundation of everything he thought he knew about her life and his own. Because Margaret had a secret, and it was waiting to be told. Night settled over St. Joseph's Medical Center, like a heavy quilt, muffling the usual hum of voices and footfalls. The fluorescent lights in the hallways dimmed to conserve energy, and a hush fell over the corridors. But sleep never came to Dr. David Miller that night. He sat alone in his office, the door closed, the window open just enough to let in the frigid Vermont air. His lab coat hung on the back of the chair like an afterthought. His tie lay crumpled on the desk beside a half-empty cup of coffee, long gone cold. The quiet tick of the wall clock seemed louder than usual, each second tapping out a rhythm that refused to let him forget. He turned toward the framed diploma on the wall, Harvard Medical School, class of '89, and then toward the awards beneath it, plaques, trophies, photos of ribbon cuttings, and conference speeches, a lifetime of accomplishments captured in wood, glass, and polished brass. But all he could see was a broken promise. He remembered that day so clearly, now the promise he made at the foot of a muddy trailer, a promise wrapped in the scent of lavender and wood smoke, spoken to the woman who gave him everything when he had nothing. Be kind, that was it. So simple, so pure. And yet, somewhere between the textbooks and surgeries, between grant proposals and board meetings, he had let it slip away. He had learned how to fix hearts, but forgotten how to hold them. He had built a life of precision, respect, and distance. He had become exactly the man Margaret feared he might. David looked down at the hospital badge clipped to his breast pocket. His title gleamed beneath the plastic. Chief Medical Officer. It had taken him nearly 3 decades to get here. He was the decision-maker now, the one with final say. His word could approve new equipment, set staff protocols, determine budgets. But just that morning, when a frail old woman had whispered that she had no money and no insurance, he hadn't even been there. He had been in a meeting, discussing vendor bids for a new MRI suite. That was the day she came back into his life on the floor. Unconscious, in the exact building he led, surrounded by people who treated her like a nuisance. And he had built this place, this system, this culture. He thought back to earlier that year, when the hospital had turned away a young single mother with bronchitis because her Medicaid paperwork wasn't finalized, or when they delayed a diabetic patient's insulin prescription due to billing disputes. Back then, he called those situations regrettable, systemic. He told himself he had no choice. But now he saw Margaret's face in all of them. He stood and walked slowly to the window. The parking lot was half empty now, dusted with snow under the yellow glare of the street. Somewhere out there, she had spent the last 3 decades surviving, alone, forgotten, left behind by a world too busy to notice the ones who fall through the cracks. And he had been one of those people once, hadn't he? David ran a hand down his face, feeling every year settle into his bones. He sat back down, opened his drawer, and pulled out a photo album, one he hadn't touched in years. Inside were pictures he'd almost forgotten. A Halloween costume made from garbage bags, a school lunchbox with a broken zipper, and there, near the back, a photo drawn in crayon, on construction paper. A boy with spiky hair, holding hands with an older woman in a blue dress. The sun overhead, smiling. The name at the bottom, written in block letters. David and Miss Maggie. He stared at it for a long time, the edges of the page soft with age. What kind of man lets go of the person who once pulled him from a river? What kind of man calls himself a healer, while forgetting the hands that once healed him? Outside his office, the hallway remained quiet. But down the corridor, in room 214, Margaret was still breathing, faint, slow, but alive, and for David, that meant there was still time. Time to do what he should have done years ago. Not just for her, but for every person like her, who had been turned away because they didn't fit the spreadsheet. But first, he had to face a larger battle, because what stood between him and change wasn't the medicine, it wasn't the patients, it wasn't even Margaret's illness, it was the system he helped build, and the people who stood to profit from keeping things exactly as they were. As the first rays of morning crept over the snow-covered hills of Maplewood, David rose from his desk, gathered the folder of Margaret's case notes, and stepped out into the quiet. hallway he had made a promise, and it was time to keep it. But what he didn't yet know, what no one could have known, was that Margaret carried a story even he couldn't imagine. A truth buried deeper than the flood that once nearly took him, and that truth was about to come to light. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The boardroom at St. Joseph's Medical Center sat on the top floor, its windows offering a panoramic view of Maplewood's snow-laced skyline. The room was sleek, modern glass walls, polished oak, and leather chairs arranged around a long, mahogany table. At one end sat the hospital's board of directors, men and women in tailored suits, briefcases at their feet, eyes sharp with calculation. At the other end, standing alone, was Dr. David Miller. He held no notes, no slides, no talking points. Only a manila folder tucked under his arm. Margaret White's medical file and a purpose carved deep into his chest. The board had called the meeting less than 12 hours after word spread about the incident. In the lobby, it hadn't taken long. A few nurses talked, a few patients whispered, and before sunrise, rumors were already moving up the chain. The director kneeled. She had no insurance. They admitted her anyway. Patrick Sullivan, the chairman of the board, a gray-haired man with the voice of a salesman and the patience of an accountant, opened the meeting with a smile as thin as the air in the room. "David," he said, folding his hands, "we've heard quite a story. Would you care to explain why a patient was admitted yesterday without financial clearance?" David didn't sit. "Her name is Margaret White. She collapsed in our lobby after being refused care. No insurance, no money, just pain. So yes, I made the call to admit her." A few members exchanged glances. One of them, a CFO from a partnering insurance firm, leaned forward. "We understand the emotional impulse, David, but we're a private facility. If we start making exceptions, we compromise everything this institution is built on." David looked at him calmly. "What exactly do you believe we're built on?" The room fell quiet for a beat too long. Sullivan cleared his throat. "David, no one's questioning your intentions. But this hospital cannot operate like a charity. We have budgets, contracts, overhead, and staff to pay. You're a physician, yes, but you're also an executive." David nodded slowly. "That's right. I'm also a man who took an oath to heal." The room grew tense. Across the table, board member Marlene Graysonen, old-school administrator with 3 decades in healthcare management, spoke up. "You know better than most that medicine isn't just about care anymore. It's about systems, accountability, sustainability. We can't afford to open the doors to anyone who walks in off the street." David walked toward the center of the room and placed Margaret's file on the table with a soft but deliberate tap. She didn't walk. In asking for comfort, she was dying, and we left her on the floor. If I hadn't come through that lobby, she would have passed out there, on our watch, in front of our staff, in front of a child in a waiting room. Silence pressed in. He looked around the table. Eyes met his, then darted away. "Tell me," he continued, quieter now, "how many more Margarets have we turned away because they didn't have the right documents? How many people have left here sicker than when they arrived, simply because they couldn't pay?" Patrick sighed. "We understand your passion, David, but this isn't about a single woman. It's about precedent. If we start treating uninsured patients for free, we open ourselves up to a tidal wave of need. Then what? Who pays?" David didn't blink. "Then we change. We create a fund, a safety net, something you want, a charity program." Someone laughed under their breath. "We're a hospital, not a soup kitchen." David leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. "No, you're wrong. We're a hospital, a place where people come when they're at their most vulnerable. If we forget that, if we forget them, then we're just another business in disguise." Patrick's smile was gone now. "You're suggesting we restructure a financial policy based on one case." "I'm suggesting we restore a soul that we've lost," David replied. Another pause. The room didn't argue, but it didn't agree either. And then Marlene folded her arms. "Let's be honest. You're not just fighting for her. You're feeling guilty." David didn't flinch. "You're right. I am. I forgot her. I left her behind 30 years ago. She saved my life and I walked away. I built this hospital, with brilliance, with ambition, with strategy, but not with heart. Not until now." There was a strange flicker in Marlene's eyes. Something almost like respect. Patrick leaned back, tapping a pen against the table. "Here's the truth, David. We can't approve anything without a full financial review. Any treatment that bypasses billing needs board authorization. If you keep admitting patients without coverage, we'll have no choice but to review your position as director." The words hung there like a verdict. David nodded slowly, quietly, then stood taller. "Then review it." The room stirred. "I'm not resigning," he added. "But if doing the right thing means risking this title, then so be it. Because Margaret White is not just a patient. She's a reminder. And there are others like her, dozens, hundreds, maybe more, who deserve to be seen, to be saved." He turned, walking toward the door. "And I'm not asking permission to care anymore." And with that, he left the room, leaving silence in his wake. No one followed. No one stopped him. But behind him, something began to shift. A crack in the glass, a fracture in the silence. David walked back through the hospital halls, head high, shoulders square, not because he was unafraid, but because fear no longer mattered. He was no longer protecting his position. He was protecting his promise. But as he reached the ICU, where Margaret rested in a quiet room filled with machines and flickering monitors, he felt the weight of a deeper truth settle over him. This wasn't just about ethics or policy anymore. It was about legacy. And what neither he nor anyone in that boardroom yet knew was that Margaret's own legacy had been waiting in the dark for 30 years, a story untold, a child lost, and a secret that would change everything. The afternoon light was thin and gray as Dr. David Miller drove through the back streets of Maplewood. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, not his assistant, not the hospital staff, not even the nurses still checking Margaret's vitals. In the ICU, this was something he needed to see with his own eyes. The address, Margaret had scribbled shakily onto the intake form, didn't look like much, a few numbers on a torn envelope. She had pulled from her coat pocket, as the nurses were, hooking her up to the heart monitor. At the time, David barely registered it. But now, the numbers had weight. Now, they pulled him through parts of the town he hadn't visited in decades. The closer he got, the more unfamiliar things became. He turned off the main road, past the train tracks, an abandoned auto shop, down a narrow lane where the snow hadn't been plowed. On either side, low houses leaned inward like old bones. The trees here were bare branches, like outstretched fingers. It was the part of town nobody mentioned in city planning meetings, the part that didn't show up in tourism brochures or real estate flyers. At the end of the lane, tucked between two rusted fences and a sagging utility pole, stood what could barely be called a home. It was a trailer, faded blue, missing panels, roof patched with scraps of tarp and plywood, a broken porch step tilted sideways. The windows were covered in thick plastic and duct tape, and the front door, it hung slightly open, swaying just enough in the wind to creak. David sat in his car for a long moment, staring. He had grown up in something like this once, but he had never imagined she still had. He stepped out slowly, the snow crunching under his shoes with each step, toward the door. The cold seemed to bite harder, not from the weather, but from what he might find inside. The air was musty, cold, still, the kind of cold that clung to the walls and soaked into the floor. There was no central heat, just a small, dented space heater in the corner, long since lifeless. The trailer's interior was painfully sparse. A single mattress on the floor with a worn quilt, a folding chair near a makeshift table made from milk crates, and an old cabinet door. A coffee can full of change sat on the windowsill, canned beans stacked beside it. No television, no refrigerator, no phone, no pictures on the wall. Just one small shelf with a Bible and a pocket-sized radio, covered in dust. David's throat tightened. In a cabinet beside the bed, he found a shoebox. Inside were folded receipts, old prescription bottles, church bulletins, and a few wrinkled Polaroids. One of them was of a much younger Margaret, holding a baby. The photo had faded badly, but the expression on her face hadn't. It was unmistakable. Joy, the kind that only exists in the first moments of motherhood. His hands trembled as he placed it back. He stepped outside, needing air, but all he could smell was smoke from a neighbor's chimney and the heavy scent of rust. As he turned to leave, a voice called out from behind a chain-link fence. "You looking for Maggie?" David turned to see an older woman in a knit hat, wrapped in a plaid coat, too big for her frame. "She used to live here," David said. The woman nodded, stepped closer. "Yeah, she did. Quiet lady, real sweet. Collected bottles most mornings. Walked all the way to the recycling center, even in the snow." "Did she have any family?" The woman hesitated. "Not that I ever saw. She talked about a son once, but it was always like he was a memory. Like someone who lived in a dream." David felt the breath leave his body. The woman looked at him closely. You know her? He didn't answer. Not directly, just nodded. Softly. Another voice joined in, a man with a shovel down the block. Maggie was tough. She'd help the kids with homework sometimes. Always told them to stay in school, stay warm, and be kind. She said kindness was the only thing you could give away and still have more of. David blinked back, the sting behind his eyes. They had known her only in fragments, but even those fragments painted a picture, more complete than any resume or biography ever could. This was who Margaret White had become while he rose through hospital ranks. Attended galas, shook hands with governors. She had been scraping together coins for expired prescriptions, living on canned soup, reading worn-out books by the dim light of a gas lamp. And through it all, she had never stopped being kind. He returned to the trailer one last time and placed a hand gently on the old table. The wood was scratched and scarred. He traced the lines with his fingers, tiny marks of survival. This wasn't just a home, it was a monument to quiet strength. Back at St. Joseph's that evening, he stood at Margaret's bedside once again. She was still sedated, her breathing shallow but steady. He took her hand and whispered, I saw your home. I saw your life. I should have been there. Her hand twitched faintly, but she didn't wake. David sat down, his voice barely audible. Why didn't you ever come find me? But deep down, he knew the answer. She never wanted to be a burden. She had given him a gift, his future, and never asked for anything in return. Even in her loneliness, she carried his promise on her shoulders, like a second skin. And yet, something about that photo of the baby in her arms still haunted him. He hadn't been a baby when she took him in. He had been 8, so who was that child? And why had she never spoken of it? The question stayed with him long after the machines lulled him into silence. Because Margaret's story wasn't finished. Not yet. And the truth that would come next would unravel everything. The room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional hum from the ventilator. The early evening sun spilled amber light across the sterile floor tiles, casting long shadows that reached the corners of room 214. Dr. David Miller sat beside Margaret's bed, his fingers gently wrapped around hers. He had barely left her side since returning from the trailer. Something in him couldn't let go, couldn't walk away again. When Margaret stirred, her eyelids fluttered with the weight of exhaustion, but her grip on his hand tightened ever so slightly. She didn't need to ask where she was. She knew, and more than that, she knew he was there. She turned her head slowly and blinked up at him. You look tired, she whispered, her voice like sand through wind. David smiled faintly. I've had worse shifts. Margaret managed a dry laugh, then coughed. He reached for a glass of water, helped her sip gently. When she leaned back into the pillow, she studied him carefully, tenderly. You always were a stubborn one, she said, eyes twinkling beneath the weariness. I used to wonder if the world would knock that out of you. Guess it didn't. He swallowed the lump in his throat. You should have come to me. You had your life, she replied. I didn't want to pull you back. I would have helped you. No, she said, shaking her head softly. You would have pitied me. The word struck sharper than he expected. I didn't raise you to hand out pity like it's spare change. She continued, her voice firmer now, each word shaped by years of hard-earned perspective. I raised you to see people, to really see them, even the ones who don't ask for help. David sat back, absorbing her gaze. It wasn't a rebuke, it was a reminder. I don't need a rescue, David. Not now. What I need is to know that everything I taught you, that everything I sacrificed meant something, that it planted a seed, that it grew into something better than me. It did, he whispered. It does. She squeezed his hand. Then prove it. Not just to me, to them, to the people still walking past clinic doors, because they're too ashamed to ask for help. David looked down. The board won't allow it. They want numbers, not stories. Margaret smiled gently. Then tell them a better story. She turned her head toward the window, where the last gold light of day clung to the horizon. I lived the life I was handed. I made peace with it. But this place you built it, doesn't need to carry the same burdens. It can be more. He studied her face, the lines that time carved, the quiet strength behind her eyes, the courage that had never left her. You're not here to pity me, David, she said, her voice softening. You're here to carry on the part of me that no one saw. The part that believed in something better. David leaned forward, resting his forehead lightly against her hand. I want to create something for people like you. A fund, a program, a real support system. So no one has to choose between care and shame again. She didn't say anything at first, just closed her eyes, and after a moment, nodded. Then make it count, she murmured. Don't make it about me. Make it about them. And just like that, the moment changed him. She didn't want charity. She wanted a legacy. Not of her name, or her hardship, but of her principles. Dignity, compassion, justice without humiliation. David stayed with her long after the sun had disappeared, the room bathed in soft blues and whites from the monitors around her. For hours, he wrote plans, proposals, letters to donors, frameworks for what would become a safety net for the invisible dot. It wasn't just about Margaret anymore. It was about everybody Margaret represented. But even as David worked late into the night, something about that Polaroid photo still pulled at his thoughts. The child in her arms, the quiet grief in her silence when he asked about family. There was more. More than legacy. More than kindness. A deeper sorrow she had never shared. And the next day, the truth would begin to unravel, piece by piece, page by page, until David would face something far more personal than a boardroom battle. He would uncover the one secret Margaret never meant for him to find, and nothing would ever be the same again. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of brown earth and brittle leaves beneath the hospital's garden path. Spring was whispering at the edges of winter, but inside the hospital walls, time still felt suspended, held still by machines, by choices, by questions left unspoken. David had barely slept. He returned again and again to the photo he found in Margaret's trailer, the one of her holding a newborn, eyes bright with joy, mouth frozen mid-laugh. It wasn't just a sweet memory. It didn't fit. He had been 8 when she took him in. This child, this baby. It wasn't him. And Margaret had never once spoken of a son. Not in the trailer. Not in the hospital. Not even now. When she knew her time was running out. That silence told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a loss, it was a wound. He took the photo to the hospital archives. A dusty floor beneath the administration wing. Most of the old files were digitized, but a few paper records remained, boxes stacked in wire cages, marked with fading Sharpie labels and yellowing tape. He didn't expect to find anything, but he did, buried in a box. Labeled Patient Records, 1996, he found a manila envelope with Margaret's name white. Margaret Elland inside, a form typed on brittle paper. Her admittance date, emergency care, childbirth, trauma. And a short handwritten note stapled to the top corner. Penned in slanted cursive. Infant placed in care of temporary custodial foster system. Mother not informed of transfer due to psychiatric evaluation. Following trauma. David froze. He read it again. And again. Placed into care, not informed. Another document confirmed it. The hospital, his hospital, had mistakenly discharged Margaret, without reuniting her with the baby. A mix-up. They had written. A clerical error. A breakdown in communication between departments. But the result was unforgivable. She had given birth here, in this very building, and her child had been taken lost in a system that treated her like a case file, not a mother. His heart pounded in his ears. Somewhere out there, she had a son, and she never knew what happened to him. He turned to the nurse, assisting in the archives, a younger woman named Melissa. Can you cross-reference this infant's file? Maybe there's a paper trail on the adoption. She nodded, already typing. A few minutes later, she paused, frowning. There's a matching file in infant male, unnamed at intake. Born the same day, transferred to social services the next morning. But, look at this. She turned the screen. David leaned in. Adoptive parents. Mr. and Mrs. Vincent Walker. Address listed. Bristol, Vermont. He blinked. The name echoed. Walker. Walker. His eyes widened. He knew that name. He worked with that name. Dr. James Walker, one of the rising stars at St. Joseph's. Respected, charismatic, ruthlessly efficient. Head of surgery since last year. David's breath caught. Could it be? Could he be? Melissa spoke again, quietly. James Walker was born in March of 1996. The same day, the adoption papers were sealed. But, well, everything lines up. David took a step back from the monitor, the weight of what he'd just uncovered pressing against his chest like a cinder block. He remembered James clearly. Sharpness, his ambition, his coolness, toward patients without means. He remembered the way he had looked at Margaret the day she was brought in, barely a glance. No recognition. No warmth. Don't yet. It had been his mother. All along. David sat alone in his office for over an hour, staring at the photo again now, unable to unsee it. The curve of the jaw. The shape of the eyes. It was him. Margaret's son had grown up a few feet away, under the same roof. And she never knew. And he hadn't either. David could barely comprehend the cruel symmetry of it. She had saved one child from the river, but she had lost her own to the tide of bureaucracy. He stared out the window, the town below glowing softly beneath the late afternoon sky. How do you tell a man he has a mother he never knew? How do you tell a dying woman that the child she mourned for 30 years stood 3 doors down, unknowingly turning her away? And worse, how do you bridge a silence built by decades of pain? That evening, as the hospital began to dim its lights, David stood beside Margaret's bed once more. She was awake, but tired. Her eyes opened slowly as he approached. "I have something I need to tell you," he said. She turned her head toward him, her face unreadable. "Your son," he said softly. "I think I found him." Margaret didn't speak, didn't move. "I know this is sudden. And I know you probably buried this hope a long time ago. But I saw the records. I saw the picture. It's him, Margaret." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't cry. Her hand reached up, trembling, to cover her mouth. I always wondered," she whispered. "I prayed he was safe. That someone held him when I couldn't." David nodded, his voice thick. "He's here. In this hospital." She gasped, a small sound that broke like glass. "He's what he doesn't know. About you. About any of it. But if you're ready, I can tell him." She lay still for a moment, her hand against her heart. Then, with a strength that defied her frail body, she whispered, "Please." And with that word, a door that had remained locked for 3 decades finally opened. But what waited on the other side would test not just one man's identity, but the very meaning of family, forgiveness, and what it takes to come home to someone you've never met. Dr. James Walker was finishing up a consult on the cardiac wing when he noticed David Miller waiting just outside the conference room. David wasn't in a lab coat. He wasn't holding a chart or clipboard. He was simply standing still, composed, but with something in his eyes that James had never seen before. Something vulnerable. James raised a brow. "Everything all right?" David nodded once. Slowly. "There's something I need to speak with you about. In private." A pause. James checked his watch. "All right." They walked together down the hallway, past bustling nurses and echoing intercoms into a small consultation room just off the main corridor. The door closed with a soft click. David didn't sit. James crossed his arms. "Waiting. It's about a patient," David began, choosing his words carefully. "Margaret White, elderly woman, came in 3 nights ago. No insurance, no support system. We admitted her under exception." James exhaled. "The one from the lobby. I remember. You made quite a scene, if I recall." David didn't react. He reached into his coat pocket and removed the old, faded Polaroid. He placed it gently on the table. James glanced at it. His face didn't change at first, but then his brow furrowed. He leaned in. There was a flicker. Something in the eyes. The shape of the jaw. An eerie familiarity. "What is this?" James asked slowly. David took a breath. "That baby is you." James chuckled. Softly at first, like it was a poorly timed joke. "Excuse me. Born March 3rd, 1996. Delivered at St. Joseph's. Margaret was your birth mother. There was a mistake. Records buried. You were placed into emergency foster care and adopted days later. She was never told." James froze. David stepped closer. "I checked everything. The birth files, the signatures, the transfer, even the adoption records. It's all there." "No," James said flatly. "No, I was adopted, yes. But I've seen the file. My parents told me your parents never knew either," David interrupted. "The file was sealed, sanitized. Nobody questioned it because nobody wanted to. She didn't matter to the system, but she mattered." James backed away, running a hand through his hair. His breath hitched. This isn't possible. That woman, she's nothing like me." David's voice was steady. "She's everything like you. Tough, precise, private. She carried the loss of you for 30 years, and never once asked the world to owe her anything." James shook his head. "You're telling me I turned her away that day?" David nodded. "Yes." Silence. James dropped into the chair behind him. For the first time in years, he looked unmoored, small, human. "I didn't even look at her," he whispered. David sat across from him now. "She never blamed you. She just missed you. She never stopped praying you had a good life." James laughed bitterly under his breath. "And I was too busy building that life to ever wonder where I came from." "She doesn't want guilt," David said gently. "She wants a moment. A goodbye, maybe a hello." James didn't speak for a long while. When he finally looked up, his eyes were rimmed with disbelief, and something deeper fear, perhaps, or longing. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you deserve to know, and she deserves to see her son again, before it's too late." Later that evening, room 214 was quiet. Margaret lay resting, her breath shallow, her eyes closed. Her hand rested atop the thin blanket, as if waiting for someone to take it. The door opened. Footsteps paused. Then slowly, James stepped inside. He looked at her, the way you look at something sacred and broken. For a long moment, he didn't say a word. He simply knelt beside the bed. His fingers reached forward, hesitant, then touched her hand. She stirred, and when her eyes opened, they met his not with surprise, but with something warmer, recognition. He opened his mouth, but no words came, just a single breath. Then, "Hi, Mom." Her lips parted, a tremble, then a sob that barely made a sound. She reached for him with fragile fingers, her palm cupping his cheek, as if to make sure he was real. He placed his forehead gently against hers, closing his eyes. They didn't need explanations, yet just presence. The years had stolen much, but not this, and in that quiet room, the noise of the world faded. The charts, the records, the mistakes, all of it fell away, leaving only the ache of time and the grace of reunion. James stayed with her through the night, never letting go of her hand. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel driven by deadlines or numbers or expectations. He felt found. But the next day would bring something more. Not grief, not regret, but a choice to carry her love forward and rewrite the legacy she never stopped building. Margaret passed quietly, just before sunrise. The nurses said it was peaceful, no struggle, just a slow fading, as if she had waited for the right moment for the world to be still enough, warm enough for her to finally let go. She held James's hand as her breath slowed. He never let go. When David entered the room, he didn't need to ask. James was sitting at her bedside, still, not crying, just holding her hand with both of his, as though something in him had become very still and very new. The morning sun was just beginning to break across the Vermont hills, casting the softest light across Margaret's face. Her expression, even in death, held peace. Not resignation, but peace. Neither man spoke for a while. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said through hands held and silence shared. Later that week, the hospital chapel held a quiet memorial. No press, no grand gestures, just a small circle of nurses, a few neighbors from her trailer park, and the two men she had raised, one in her arms, one in her spirit. David read a line from the old Bible she kept in her trailer, pages stained and brittle. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." James stood beside him and added quietly, "She didn't leave behind much, but she gave more than most people ever do." The following Monday, David called an emergency board meeting. This time, he came with a binder, no anger, no demands, just a plan. He laid out a proposal for the Margaret White Compassionate Care, Fonta Permanent, privately funded program that would cover treatment costs for uninsured and underinsured patients in crisis. No red tape, no judgment, just help. He detailed how it would be financed through donor partnerships, redirected administrative costs, and a portion of the annual gala revenue that previously went toward hospital marketing. He told them Margaret's story not as a plea, but as a blueprint. She didn't ask for pity, David said, his voice firm. She asked for dignity, and this is how we give it. Some board members pushed back, but not as strongly as before. Something had shifted. Stories had spread. Staff morale had changed. Margaret had become more than a patient. She had become a turning point. When James stood to endorse the proposal, it was the first time the room went fully silent. "She was my mother," he said simply, "and I didn't know it until it was almost too late. I spent my life perfecting procedures, building my name. But I missed the most important surgery I ever needed to perform, the one in here." He placed his hand over his heart. "I can't undo what was lost, but I can choose what comes next." The vote passed unanimously. The fund launched 3 weeks later, a modest start of social workers, a small team of nurses, and an office tucked near the ER entrance with a wooden plaque that read, "The Margaret White Center for Compassionate Care." The first patient was a young man who had walked 12 miles to the hospital after collapsing at a bus station. He had no ID, no insurance, no hope. They welcomed him anyway. The staff didn't ask about money first. They asked how he felt. The story spread through town. Donations trickled in, then surged. Former patients, churches, retired nurses, even a Group of high school students raised money through a bake sale, leaving a note for Miss Maggie. David stayed on as director, but he changed. He walked the floors more, sat with families, took off his coat. He'd often be found in the Margaret Center, holding a cup of coffee and listening, just listening. James, too, transformed. He restructured the surgical residency program to include rotations in public health and crisis care. He mentored differently, spoke less in statistics, more in stories. One day, a nurse caught him slipping a small framed photo onto his office shelf. It was old, faded, a young Margaret, holding a newborn in her arms. The nurse smiled. James didn't explain. He didn't have to. And so, life moved forward, but not without her. Margaret White, a woman with no savings, no title, no voice in powerful rooms, had reshaped the very heart of a hospital. Not through protests or policy, but through quiet endurance, quiet love, and the kind of presence that lingers long after it's gone. Her grave was marked with a simple stone beneath an oak tree on the hospital grounds. No epitaph, just her name and the years she walked this earth. But every time someone walked through the Margaret Center's doors, her memory lit a small candle in their story. Not pity, legacy, end in that legacy, to men once strangers. Now family kept a promise. Not because they were heroes, but because one woman, with nothing in her pockets, gave them everything that mattered. And they finally understood what it meant to give it back.